The sun-drenched town square was brimming with energy. Children squealed with delight, balloons bobbed in the breeze, and the scent of buttered popcorn mixed with sugary cotton candy filled the air. It was the grand launch of Bright Minds, a new educational app created by tech magnate Daniel Grant, a man whose life was defined by success, numbers, and polished speeches. Yet amidst all the cheer and colors of that corporate celebration, one small voice cut through the noise like a whisper in a cathedral. A little girl named Lily looked up at him and said, not with drama, not with tears, but with the unfiltered honesty only a child could deliver, "Sir, I don't want toys. I want a dad." Time froze. The music stopped. Faces turned. Daniel, caught mid-motion, still holding a toy car meant as a prize, found himself speechless. The air thickened with something far heavier than celebration, truth. Standing just behind Lily was her mother, Claire Bennett. Dressed in a worn coat zipped up against pride more than the weather, she rushed to soften the moment. But her daughter, too young to understand the weight of her words, simply continued with innocence, "I already have toys. I just want someone who stays." That moment, though fleeting, stirred something deep within Daniel's guarded heart. He had conquered boardrooms, disrupted markets, and shaped the future of learning, yet nothing had prepared him for the sight of a little girl who asked for something no algorithm could deliver. As Claire quietly declined charity from concerned onlookers, choosing dignity over desperation, Daniel watched her walk away, her back straight, her daughter held close. Not as a plea for pity, but a portrait of quiet strength. What Daniel didn't realize then was that those few seconds would haunt him more powerfully than any shareholder crisis ever had. Claire and Lily weren't looking for a hero. They weren't seeking rescue. What they represented, honesty, resilience, and unspoken yearning, was something his wealth had never bought him: purpose. This story isn't about grand gestures or fairy tale wealth. It's about how one raw moment, one honest plea, cracked the surface of a man's carefully constructed world and let something real begin to grow. In the heart of a crowd, through the eyes of a child, Daniel Grant glimpsed something he hadn't known he was missing, and what unfolded after would become the most meaningful chapter of his life. The next morning, despite the frenzy of headlines and viral clips from the product launch, all Caleb Shaw could hear was the soft, haunting voice of a little girl who said she didn't want toys. She wanted a dad. That voice belonged to Elsie, the daughter of a single mother named Grace, who had stumbled into his high-profile app event by chance, looking only for a sandwich and a moment of joy for her daughter. Yet what happened there had shaken something deep within him, something no boardroom or business plan ever had. Unable to let the moment go, Caleb wandered into the nearby park the following morning in search of clarity and fresh air. That's when he spotted them, Grace and Elsie, sitting on a bench sharing a sandwich, their interaction so gentle, so simple, that it froze Caleb in his tracks. He approached, struck up a cautious conversation, and despite her clear reserve, Grace let him sit beside them. What followed was not a dramatic overture, but something quieter, more powerful. Caleb listened as Grace, with quiet pride and without bitterness, told him of her struggles, her daughter's absent father, and her refusal to accept pity or shortcuts. He began to see her not as a figure of sympathy, but as a woman of unshakable dignity who chose presence and integrity over convenience. That evening, Caleb did something he never did. He used the girl's contact details stored from the event, not to sell a product or pitch a service, but to help anonymously. He connected Grace with a foundation that quietly supported single mothers with remote editorial jobs. She accepted, not knowing he was behind it, and excelled with passion and precision. He also arranged a scholarship for Elsie, along with supplies and books delivered in plain packaging marked only Early Learners Fund. Grace never questioned where it came from. She simply worked harder, giving her daughter a life built not on gifts, but on effort and love. Over time, Caleb kept running into them, always casual, always respectful, until a quiet friendship formed. Meals on benches replaced boardroom dinners, and slowly something shifted in his heart. Not pity, not charity, but admiration. But then, when it all felt like it might blossom into something real, Caleb's mother, suspicious and cold, confronted Grace in public with words so cruel they left Grace humiliated and heartbroken. She vanished, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt powerless. It wasn't until days later, in a silent park at dusk, that he found her again. He apologized not just for his mother, but for failing to protect the woman and child who had come to mean more to him than anything. Grace listened, and in a quiet moment, with no grand declarations, they sat side by side, hands intertwined, something unspoken passing between them, perhaps not a promise, but the beginning of one. Caleb didn't just want to help them anymore, he wanted to belong with them, because what Elsie had said, what she had unknowingly awakened, was a truth deeper than anything he'd built with money, the longing to matter to someone, not because of wealth, but because of love. In the days following their emotional park encounter, something shifted quietly but powerfully between Caleb Shaw and Grace. For a man who had built his life on precision, strategy, and polished detachment, the simplicity of their connection unsettled him, but in a way that felt like truth finally slipping through the cracks of his carefully maintained world. He found himself returning to the park, not by accident, but with the hope of spotting them again, and more often than not, there they were. Grace with her modest tote bag, braiding little Elsie's hair on their usual bench, and Elsie bright-eyed and endlessly curious, feeding ducks or chasing the soft rustle of falling leaves. Caleb didn't intrude. He observed quietly, trying to understand this world that seemed so far from his own yet drew him in with magnetic pull. What struck him most wasn't their poverty but their peace. Grace moved through the world with a quiet dignity that defied her circumstances, picking up litter at the playground, helping an elderly woman cross the street, and always exchanging kindness for kindness, never handouts. Her daughter Elsie mirrored her values. She shared snacks with children she didn't know, said thank you to birds, and lit up rooms not with volume but with presence. It wasn't long before Caleb's admiration deepened into something harder to define, something like longing. But it wasn't until he arranged anonymous opportunities, a remote editorial job for Grace, a scholarship and supplies for Elsie, that he fully grasped what had been missing from his life: meaning. Grace embraced the work without hesitation or entitlement. She labored late into the night reviewing lesson content, fixing errors, and offering thoughtful suggestions. Her feedback wasn't just functional, it was warm, accessible, real. The foundation team, unaware of who had referred her, believed she must have formal training in child psychology. She didn't. She simply knew children because she had one, and paid attention. Meanwhile, Elsie bloomed with the new books and materials delivered to their modest flat. Grace never tried to trace the source of their good fortune. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, honoring it through work, not dependency. And Caleb watched, still hidden behind layers of anonymity, struck by the unshakable decency of a woman who had been handed so little, yet gave so much. Eventually, he let chance guide him back into their lives, bumping into them at the park, at the library, near a street vendor. They began to talk more, about small things at first, stories, memories, Elsie's fascination with stars. Grace was never flirtatious, never coy. She was direct, careful, but not cold. Her strength wasn't in bravado, but in unwavering self-respect. Caleb had met women who dazzled, women who demanded, but Grace moved differently. She invited no rescue. She only accepted truth. Over warm dinners on benches and afternoons spent watching Elsie play, something slowly unfolded between them. A connection built not on performance, but presence. A love story written in quiet glances and shared silences. And though Grace never asked Caleb for anything, it was he who found himself needing more, not just to be near them, but to be part of the peace they created. It was no longer about helping, it was about becoming. And with each passing day, Caleb realized that the little girl who once said, "I don't want toys, I want a dad," had opened a door not just to his heart, but to the man he could become. The day Caleb Shaw overheard Grace's story about Elsie's father changed everything. Until then, his connection with them had been quietly blooming. Simple morning visits in the park, casual conversations over sandwiches, and the unspoken warmth of shared company. But as Grace's voice softened, her eyes fixed on her daughter picking daisies nearby, her truth came spilling out, not with bitterness, but with a calm acceptance born of hard-earned resilience. "He was my first love," she said. "We thought we could conquer the world together, until I told him I was pregnant." That one confession sliced through Caleb like a blade. Grace hadn't shared it to gain pity or sympathy. Her tone made that clear. She wasn't lamenting a loss. She was illuminating her path. A path walked not by choice but by courage. Caleb saw in that moment a woman who had raised her child on strength and values rather than comfort and convenience. She had every reason to be bitter, but instead she had chosen dignity. "I don't need pity," she added, voice steady. "And Elsie doesn't need someone who shows up out of guilt. She needs examples of strength, not rescue." Her words lingered with Caleb long after their conversation ended. He couldn't stop replaying them in his mind, not because they hurt, but because they demanded reflection. All his life he'd measured impact by action, by strategy, by achievement. Yet here was a woman showing him the quiet power of restraint, of staying when leaving would have been easier, of giving when there was nothing left to give. Grace didn't ask for help. She didn't chase after what was lost. She simply stood tall in the present and gave her daughter a future shaped by integrity. And Elsie, bright, curious Elsie, was proof of that legacy. Her smile wasn't marred by absence, it was lit by love. Her kindness, her honesty, her calm courage, they weren't accidental, they were taught. Caleb began to realize that Grace wasn't just admirable, she was extraordinary. Not because of her suffering, but because of what she did with it. She turned abandonment into devotion, hardship into character, and absence into presence. Caleb, a man surrounded by polished success, had never met anyone so whole in her brokenness. He no longer saw her as a woman to uplift, but as someone to learn from. And as he sat beside her on that sun-dappled bench, listening to her story unfold, he understood something he hadn't before. Love is not just about being there when it's easy. It's about standing firm when everything else walks away. And Grace had stood firm every single day. That, Caleb thought, is what makes someone irreplaceable. That is what makes someone worthy, not of pity, but of love. Caleb Shaw had always been a man of plans, measured, calculated, and carefully executed. But ever since that day in the park when Elsie asked for a dad instead of a toy, something had shifted deep within him. He found himself revisiting the place where Grace and Elsie shared their simple mornings, drawn not by duty, but by a quiet longing to understand them better. What he saw wasn't just a mother and child making the best of less. It was something purer. Grace was never idle. She picked up rubbish others left behind. She helped elderly strangers cross busy roads. She tidied tables for food vendors in exchange for soup or rice, never asking for anything, only offering what she could. There was no bitterness in her actions, no silent plea for recognition. Everything she did was intentional, kind, and quietly dignified. Elsie mirrored her mother's spirit. Whether offering half her snack to a crying child or greeting every person with a bright good morning, her small gestures revealed a world of empathy far beyond her years. Caleb observed this quietly, from a respectful distance, realizing that neither of them were defined by their lack of money, but by their abundance of character. And still he didn't know what to do with the way they made him feel, more seen, more grounded, more human. In boardrooms he was respected, in charity galas, admired. But with Grace and Elsie, he didn't feel powerful. He felt present. That was new. That was real. Watching them, Caleb recognized something he had missed in his carefully curated world. A life not driven by ambition or profit, but by love in its purest, quietest form. Grace had no audience, no strategy. Her values were stitched into every moment, every word, every choice. And Elsie, because of that, was growing up not with entitlement but gratitude. It was this understanding that moved Caleb to act, not out of pity, but respect. He knew Grace would never accept a handout. She'd made that clear. So he did what he did best, solve problems, but from the shadows. Through a nonprofit he supported, he anonymously helped secure Grace a flexible remote editorial job, perfectly matched to her skills and parenting responsibilities. He ensured the opportunity came without strings or names attached. Just work she could be proud of and pay that honored her time. She accepted it, cautiously but willingly. And as Caleb watched her flourish through back-end reports, her insightful feedback, her dedication, her professionalism, he felt pride, not in what he had given her, but in what she had always had in herself. She had just needed a door to be open, but his efforts didn't stop there. Elsie's light shone too brightly to be dimmed by circumstance. Caleb arranged a 2-year scholarship for her through a local educational initiative, again anonymously. Books, supplies, after-school programs, all sent in plain packaging with a simple note. Some children deserve every chance to keep dreaming. He didn't want praise or thanks. He only wanted them to thrive, to breathe a little easier, to have a little more room to dream, and though he never said it aloud, he hoped that, in doing so, he might also heal something inside himself, something that had been missing long before Elsie's words stopped him in that plaza. Because this was never about rescuing them. This was about recognizing their worth. Grace didn't need saving. She needed space. And Caleb, in giving that, found a part of himself he never knew was lost. Caleb Shaw never anticipated that an act as ordinary as buying lunch would become a moment of quiet reckoning. That afternoon, distracted and tired, he had approached a food cart near the park, ordered a simple noodle bowl, and reached into his coat pocket, only to realize with a sinking weight that both his wallet and phone were back in the office. The vendor's voice was sharp. "No tab here." A murmur rose among onlookers. For Caleb, a man used to control prestige in polished boardrooms, this small slip brought an unusual flush of embarrassment. But before the moment could curdle into something worse, a gentle voice broke through. "I've got it." It was Grace. She stepped forward calmly, handed the vendor a few notes without asking for change, and turned to him quietly. "Come on." He followed, stunned, not by the gesture itself, but by how she made it seem so natural, so free of judgment or pity. When he started to speak, she cut him off gently. "I didn't do that because you're the CEO. I did it because I hate seeing anyone embarrassed in public, that's all." No drama, no patronizing tone, just raw decency. It hit Caleb harder than any confrontation in a boardroom. That evening, as he stood alone in his apartment, so immaculate, so silent, he couldn't shake the feeling. He wasn't used to being helped, certainly not by someone like Grace, a woman who'd never asked for anything, never hinted at need, who had quietly earned his respect without ever trying to impress. She saw past the layers of his wealth and titles and responded not to status, but to the moment, human to human. For the first time in a long while, Caleb realized how rare that was in his life, and that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be seen for his power anymore. He wanted to be seen as a person. From that moment forward, his connection with Grace and Elsie shifted. No longer driven by curiosity or anonymous support, it became something more intentional. He began inviting them, casually at first, for walks, meals, shared moments. Nothing grand. Grace always deflected anything too lavish. "No white tablecloths," she'd joke. "Elsie's not used to cloth napkins." So they ate noodles on park benches, shared sandwiches under the trees, and chased fireflies in the summer dusk. They spoke of stars, of childhood dreams, of dogs and old family recipes. Elsie started calling him Uncle Caleb, and though Grace froze the first time, he didn't correct the child. Because somewhere in the quiet stitching of these moments, a bond was forming, not flashy, not defined, but real. What moved Caleb most wasn't how Grace let him in, but how fiercely she protected her dignity throughout. She never leaned on him. She never allowed herself to be reduced to a cause. And that's precisely why he couldn't stop thinking about her. In a world of business deals and manipulations, Grace stood apart, firm, self-respecting, and full of quiet strength. Every shared moment only deepened his admiration. Not because she was struggling, but because she was proud. Not because she was kind to him, but because she was kind to everyone, without agenda, without audience. And that one small moment, her paying for his lunch, became a symbol in Caleb's mind. A reminder that love doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the form of dignity preserved, of embarrassment quietly averted, of presence offered without question. It wasn't about the $10 meal. It was about seeing someone, truly seeing them, and choosing compassion over distance. That was the kind of strength Caleb had never known he needed. And Grace, with all her quiet grace, gave it freely. Caleb Shaw had spent years mastering the art of strategy, every move measured, every word calculated. Yet no amount of business acumen could have prepared him for the quiet, steady way Grace Hamilton and her daughter Elsie began to reshape the contours of his world. It wasn't with fanfare or emotional declarations, but with simple moments. A sandwich shared on a park bench, a story told under an oak tree, a laugh between mother and daughter so pure it stopped him in his tracks. What started as chance meeting slowly evolved into intention. He found himself frequenting the library during children's story hour or jogging paths he knew they took. It wasn't manipulation, it was longing. He wanted to be around them, to soak in the warmth that their presence brought. Grace, always poised, always kind but guarded, met him with grace, never too close, never too distant. And Elsie, with her wide eyes and curiosity, welcomed him with innocent affection, eventually calling him Uncle Caleb, a name that melted something inside him he didn't know was frozen. Each day that passed, Caleb noticed more. The way Grace braided Elsie's hair with such care, how she offered a quiet thank you to the birds when feeding them crumbs, how she knelt to help elderly strangers without waiting to be asked. She moved through the world with dignity and decency, never demanding anything but earning respect from everyone who saw her. For Caleb, used to boardroom battles and performative kindness, it was disarming. Grace was the kind of woman who did the right thing simply because it was right, not for applause, not for gain. And it struck him how rare that was. She didn't try to impress him, which only deepened his admiration. In truth, it was her authenticity that slowly unraveled him, that made him want to be a better man, not for her approval, but because she made him feel human again. They never talked about labels or what their connection meant, but there was an unspoken current between them, flowing deeper with each passing day. Caleb found himself opening up in ways he never had before, sharing childhood stories, failures, hopes long buried under ambition. And Grace listened, not like someone analyzing him, but like someone who genuinely cared. In her presence, the layers of wealth, success, and image felt unnecessary. He wasn't the CEO when he sat with her. He was just a man, one who had finally stopped running long enough to feel. Elsie's giggles, Grace's quiet strength, their shared stories, it all began to feel like home. What Caleb came to realize was that he wasn't falling for someone who needed saving. He was falling for someone who had already saved herself. Grace had built a life out of love and integrity, even when circumstances had been harsh, and that resilience was what drew him in. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was a warrior in plain clothes, and every time he saw her, whether kneeling in the grass beside Elsie or quietly laughing at a silly story, he felt something stir, soft at first but undeniable. Respect, admiration, love. Not loud and dramatic like he'd always imagined, but quiet and rooted, like a tree that had been growing all along. In a world where Caleb had been surrounded by people who only saw his title, Grace and Elsie saw something else, the man beneath. And for the first time, that was enough. He no longer wanted to orchestrate moments. He just wanted to be present in them, to walk alongside Grace without needing to lead, to hold Elsie's hand without needing to impress, to sit on park benches and watch fireflies and feel like maybe he belonged. Because somewhere between those shared noodle bowls and bedtime stories, Caleb had stopped seeing Grace and Elsie as people to support and started seeing them as people he could never imagine his life without. And in the stillness of those simple days, he discovered that the greatest connection isn't forged through power but through presence. And love, he realized, wasn't something to chase. It was something to become. It was supposed to be just another peaceful morning. Grace Hamilton and her daughter Elsie sitting outside their favorite bakery, sharing a small fruit salad, laughing at the pigeons skittering about. But that serenity shattered the moment an elegant woman in cream cashmere and a hardened expression stepped out of a sleek black car and strode directly towards them. "You're Grace, aren't you?" the woman asked coldly, her chin lifted with disdain. Grace stood instinctively, her protective instincts on high alert. "Yes. Can I help you?" The woman didn't answer at first. She sneered, scanning Grace's worn clothes and Elsie's scuffed shoes. Then she revealed her identity. "I'm Caleb's mother." The words dropped like a stone into still water. Grace didn't flinch, but her hand slipped protectively onto Elsie's shoulder. What followed was not a conversation. It was an accusation cloaked in privilege. "I see right through you," the woman hissed. A struggling single mom latching onto a wealthy man. Classic. Grace was stunned. People around them began to notice. The sharp tone, the expensive clothes, it all screamed judgment. Elsie, confused and frightened, clutched her mum's skirt. Grace instinctively bent down to shield her, her heart pounding. "We don't need anyone's charity," she said calmly, "and we certainly don't need your approval." Then, with quiet strength, she took Elsie's hand and walked away, her shoulders straight, her pride intact. But she didn't make it home before the tears came. Not in public, not in front of Elsie, but behind the safety of their locked front door, when her daughter had fallen asleep and the silence left space for heartbreak. Caleb was blindsided when he found out. He hadn't known his mother would go so far, hadn't even told her about Grace in detail, just enough apparently for the woman to search and judge. He called, texted, pleaded for a chance to explain, but Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. The shame, the humiliation, the anger, it all clashed with the vulnerability she had begun to feel toward Caleb. Was it all just a game to them? Had she misjudged him, trusted too soon? Caleb, alone in his penthouse, stood by the window that night, haunted by the thought that he had lost the only two people who ever made him feel grounded. It wasn't just guilt that filled him, it was grief. Because in the echo of Elsie's voice asking for a dad and in Grace's eyes that held both fire and hurt, he discovered something irreplaceable. Real connection, not rooted in wealth but in shared values. Days later, Caleb found her again at the park. Alone this time, no Elsie, no smiles. He approached with caution, but his apology wasn't rehearsed. "I should have protected you," he said softly. "I should have told the world what you mean to me." Grace didn't speak at first. Her silence was a storm of emotions. But eventually she looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his eyes. They talked not about the past, but about presence, about love that doesn't ask for approval, about being enough just as they were. It was then she allowed his hand to touch hers, not as a symbol of surrender, but of something new, a quiet willingness to heal. What followed wasn't a fairy tale, but something far stronger, real effort, real growth. The final act of grace came when Caleb's mother, unannounced and unsure, arrived at Grace's door with a casserole and a small box wrapped for Elsie. There was no apology on her lips, but something had shifted in her eyes, something that looked like acceptance. Grace hesitated, then welcomed her in. That evening, mismatched chairs around a small table hosted a dinner that was far from perfect but beautifully human. Elsie chattered away, delighted with her new doll. Caleb's mother asked about school, and Caleb and Grace sat side by side, fingers interlaced beneath the table, their silence no longer strained but shared. Because love, they had learned, isn't always a loud declaration. Sometimes it's a woman standing up to cruelty with poise. Sometimes it's a man choosing to stay when things get hard. And sometimes it's a little girl who only ever asked for something simple. A dad who didn't leave, and a mom who never stopped believing in dignity. In that home, around that table, something began. Not a performance, not a rescue, but a family formed by truth, earned trust, and a second chance no money could ever buy. Life has a quiet way of reminding us that the greatest gestures aren't always grand or wrapped in gold. They're the ones whispered in moments of vulnerability, in acts of kindness that ask for nothing in return. When Caleb found himself short on both wallet and pride at a modest food stall, it wasn't a chauffeur or a black card that came to his rescue. It was Grace. With just a few bills and a gentle, almost dismissive "come on," she saved him not just from public embarrassment, but from the illusion that success meant never needing help. That moment, so small, so human, taught Caleb something years of boardroom deals never had: humility. Real dignity, he realized, isn't displayed in power or possessions, but in how we treat each other when no one's watching. Grace didn't help him because he was a CEO. She helped because he was human, and she knew what it felt like to be exposed and unguarded. And Caleb, for all his influence, had never been seen so clearly. That one act, the simplicity of care without expectation, shifted something deep inside him. There's a powerful lesson here for all of us. We often chase approval, validation, or comfort in things we can buy or control. But life's richest moments are often unplanned, unfiltered, and uncomfortable. Grace's actions reminded us that strength is quiet, rooted not in pride, but in compassion. And perhaps the most valuable relationships are born not from need or convenience, but from the choice to show up, to offer kindness, and to stay. In a world obsessed with appearances and transactions, her gesture became a mirror for Caleb and for all of us, reflecting what truly matters. If this story stirred something in your heart, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been touched by an unexpected act of kindness? And don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more true-to-life tales that celebrate love, hope, and the quiet power of humanity. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Stay kind, stay human, and never underestimate the impact of a single sincere act.